I like to dedicate this to all of the Creator's righteous children. I have some food in my bag for you. Not that edible food, that food you eat. No, I have some food for thought. Since knowledge is infinite, it has infinitely fell on me.
Peace and blessings. Matakuyo Yasin to all of my relations. I come to you from my living room for another episode of Afro-Indigenous. Today I'm going to be talking about a documentary that I watched last night. And it was a documentary called Rumble, the Indians Who Rock the World. And it's the story of how Indigenous people from North America, from the United States and Canada, both helped to create what we call modern American music. That involves genres such as the blues, jazz, rock and roll, folk, pop, heavy metal, hardcore rock, punk rock, you name it, we had a hand in it, really. And hip-hop, but they don't really talk about hip-hop in this documentary. Sort of, if you count Taboo from Black Eyed Peas. But basically, this is basically a really important story because oftentimes the Indigenous, the Native American story is oftentimes left out of the creation of modern American music. Because without our contributions, with our Black brothers and sisters, there really wouldn't be music as you know it today. And so I found this documentary to be very enlightening, to be very on the nose, and to really bring a beautiful cultural landscape into my world. Growing up, being Indigenous and African American, I grew up with parents who were history buffs. They loved learning about history. They knew a lot of history, and they taught me a lot about my cultural history, whether that being Creole from New Orleans, or being Indigenous, or just being African American. I was taught a lot about my culture. And through this documentary, I learned even more about the cultures that my parents came from. You know, on my mom's side, she is Indigenous on both her mom and father's side. On her mother's side, she is Cherokee and Cheyenne. And on her father's side, she is Blackfoot and Powhatan. And it's a really beautiful blending of cultures. On her mother's side, she is also Irish, and on her father's side she is French. And with my father, he is Creole, so he's from New Orleans, and so he's Creole, so he's a mixture of Native American, French, and Black. And of course on my mom's side we're African American as well. So I just have this really rich culture all around me that I learned about a lot growing up. But what I never really learned about, I learned about the blues, I learned about jazz, because those are my dad's two favorite genres of music. He was in love, and still is, with the blues and jazz. And where he grew up, back in the 50s and 60s, in New Orleans, he grew up around jazz and blues, just like so on the nose. Delta blues, jazz, like it was just everywhere for him. And my mom, she grew up in LA in the 50s and 60s. And so she was into the Motown sound. She was into the girl groups of that time. But because of where my parents grew up and the cultures that they were around, these were just the genres of music that they knew and loved. And because of the way that Native Americans have always been treated in this country since the beginning, unfortunately, a lot of people didn't know that a lot of the groups, the rock and roll groups, jazz groups, Delta blues, that a lot of those people either had Native American heritage in them or were straight up Indigenous people. They either were mixed with Black and Indigenous or were just straight up Indigenous. And this story, this documentary, Rumble, the Indians Who Rock the World, is a really beautiful telling of that story. Rumble, the Indians Who Rock the World, brings to light the profound and missing chapter in the history of American music, Indigenous Influence, featuring music icons Charlie Patton, Mildred Bailey, Link Wray, Jimi Hendrix, Jesse Ed Davis, Buffy Sainte-Marie, Robbie Robertson, Randy Castillo, and Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas. Rumble shows how these pioneering Native American musicians helped shape the soundtracks of our lives, which is really true, because as they went through different genres of music, as they went through different bands that were culturally relevant and artists who were culturally relevant in the 50s and 60s, it was like all this music that I knew, all this information and things that I knew, but I didn't know that some of these people were Indigenous. And that's the missing link with music, because you cannot talk about American music without bringing in the Indigenous story. You just can't. You just really can't. And one of the things that they talked about, and I sit here and I eat my grits, which is, very timely. One of the stories they talk about is the Mardi Gras Indians, and they're the perfect example of Black and Indigenous people coming together and making a very rich and unique culture together. If you don't know the story of the Black and Indigenous people of New Orleans, then you need to learn. But basically, back in the day, and this happened a lot through the South during slavery, but back in the day, Indigenous cultures were sovereign nations at this point. Yes, many of them had these treaties with the American government, and they got screwed over through that, but a lot of them were sovereign nations, right? So because of that, when runaway slaves would run away and they had nowhere else to go, sometimes they would retreat and become part of the indigenous tribes that lived along, those southern places. And because of that, cultures like the Mardi Gras Indians became a thing, because you started to have intermarrying between Black people and Indigenous people. And that was really just how people like my mom's people and my dad's people became who they are, because of the intermingling between Black and Indigenous people, and how they were able to help the runaway slaves by intermarrying with them so that they became part of the tribe and they became, free people, which was incredible. Yes, we can talk about, how some tribes did have slaves, but that's a whole nother story that I'm not getting into right now. But pretty much, Black people and Indigenous people have been part of this cultural landscape of this country for forever. But in the 50s and 60s, when many Indigenous people were uprising, were bringing their voices to the forefront, a lot of Indigenous people who were dark-skinned had to disguise themselves as Black people, because, and I tell people this a lot, and most people don't believe me, but it's true, being Indigenous back then was worse than being Black when it came to persecution. And so a lot of Indigenous people had to masquerade as Black people just so that they wouldn't be persecuted in the way that they were. And so that's how a lot of Black people today are seen as Black, but actually are Indigenous, or at least have some Indigenous ancestry in them. And it's really a beautiful story, a sad story that we had to hide our culture for so long, but it's just beautiful that this documentary was made so that we could come out and we could talk about the music that we loved, the music that we helped to shape in this country, and that we don't always get celebrated for. So some of the people who, and the artists, the musicians, the historians, and the family members who participated in the film included Buddy Guy, Stephen Van Zandt, Tony Bennett, Taj Mahal, Siler Neville, Ivan Neville of the Neville Brothers, Martin Scorsese, Quincy Jones, John Trudell before he passed away, David Fricke, of Rolling Stone magazine. Steven Tyler, who, by the way, I just learned recently that Steven Tyler, his daughter actually had their DNA done in one of those, like, you know, the ones they have on TV where they have the celebrities go and find their DNA and all that stuff. And they found out that they had some black in them. And I was like, hell yeah. Yeah, you do. Because I love Aerosmith, by the way. I love Steven Tyler. I love Aerosmith. And I always, for some reason, thought that they had some kind of something, some mojo in them that made them so awesome. And now when it says that they had some black ancestry, I was like, okay, that makes sense. That makes 100% sense. So, just putting that out there. Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas, Derek Trucks, Corey Harris, Guy Davis, Alvin Youngblood Harrod, Monk Bolrex, sorry if I'm mispronouncing any of these names, George Clinton, Jackson Brown, Joy Hare, Iggy Pop, Wayne Crummer of the MC5, Marky Ramone, Tyler Hawks from Foo Fighters, Taylor Hawks of Foo Fighters, Pura Fay, Dan Urbach from the Black Keys, which is one of my favorite groups as well. Phil Sozan, who performed with Ozzy Osbourne. Matt Schrum from Guns N' Roses. Mike Ines of Alice in Chains. Robert Trujillo of Metallica. Slash from Guns N' Roses. Charlie Sexton, who was with Bob Dylan. Rhiannon Gideon from Carolina Chocolate Drops. Pat Vegas of Redbone. And Robbie Robertson and Buffy Sainte-Marie, among others. Now, sorry I was mispronouncing a lot of those bands, the musicians from those bands' names. Most of those bands actually are some of my favorite bands. Like, I love Alice in Chains, I love the Black Keys, I love Guns N' Roses, I love Carolina Chocolate Drops, I love, Bob Dylan. Like, these are such great musicians that I love. Unfortunately, I cannot pronounce their names, and I'm sorry about that. Anyways, back to my story. So, yeah, this was really an important documentary that I think a lot of people should go out and watch, honestly. Like, so take Charlie Patton, for example. When they talk about Charlie Patton, he was alive during slavery and post-slavery. During that time, a lot of people, like I said, a lot of black people, runaway slaves, would go and intermingle with the tribes so that they wouldn't have to be slaves. And so because of that, here comes Charlie Patton, who is Black and Indigenous. And he is one of the forefathers, the godfathers of the Delta Blues. And they were telling a story of how when you're a slave or when you're whatever, to get out of having to do field work, you would go out and be the musician, right? You would go out and be a musician so you could play for white people so you wouldn't have to be out there in the field. And he was one of the top-notch musicians. He was incredible. He was an icon, and he's just incredible. I forgot to mention also that they talked about Howlin Wolf, which was an incredible blues artist. Incredible. And, a lot of the forefathers of blues did have some indigenous blood in them. You know what I mean? And that's really important to talk about, Mildred Bailey, who was one of the queens of jazz music, she was indigenous, right? And it's just really beautiful to see that throughout history, throughout music, modern American music, there was an indigenous touch throughout all of it. You know what I mean? Jimi Hendrix, for example, he had a grandmother on his dad's side, I think, who was indigenous, and he took a lot from her. She was Cherokee, and he was really into his mixing of cultures, Black, indigenous, Scottish. Like, he loved his mixing of cultures, and the way that he dressed. Like, yes, it was the 60s, and yes, he was about that peace and love and flower power and psychedelic stuff. But you could also tell that he was giving you that native vibe whenever he would wear his turquoise, whenever he would wear, any type of the shirts he would wear. Like, he was giving you that native, his hats with the feathers in them. He was giving you those native vibes. And it was really beautiful to see how he just really loved his indigenous culture. You know what I mean? Jesse Ed Davis, they said, was really into his indigenous culture. Sadly, he passed away of a heroin overdose, unfortunately. But he got to play with some of the biggest artists in the world, and it was just incredible to see. He was playing with Bob Dylan. He helped John Trudell when he was doing his spoken word stuff. He was doing a lot of incredible music, and sadly, his talent was taken too early, but he was an incredible artist. Buffy Sainte-Marie, she was a folk artist in sort of the vein of like some of the bigger folk artists like Bob Dylan and just so many. And she was talking about indigenous issues during a time where no one wanted to hear about indigenous issues. No one wanted to hear about native folk. But she was doing it in a folky type way. And because of the time period that she was doing this in, it was really making a blast in the United States. But unfortunately, because of circumstances and things that happened, she got blacklisted for a whole long time until a Canadian DJ or radio DJ apologized to her, because the American government was trying to basically make her into enemy number one because she was indigenous and talking about indigenous struggles, indigenous power, indigenous rights, and they couldn't handle it. And it's really a great story of how all of this came together. Randy Castillo, he was one of the leading heavy metal drummers in the 80s. And, he was around like the Guns N' Roses of them all, and Metallica, and like all these heavy metal bands, right? And he was just giving it his all. Like, he toured with Ozzy Osbourne. Like, he was giving it his all. Like, from the clips that I've seen and like during the documentary when I was watching it, he was incredible. Like, he had a style of his own. Like, they say that he was one of the best heavy metal drummers of them all, and he was Apache. And his grandmother was a curandera because he was half Apache, half indigenous Mexican. And so he had a really large appreciation, and he really respected his indigenous culture. And unfortunately, he passed away as well, but from cancer. And I mean, that's really, really sad and tragic. But he made a lasting impact on music, on heavy metal music, on music in general. And he was indigenous. And he was spiritual, and he cared about his culture. And I just found that to be so beautiful. So beautiful. I mean, take Redbone, for example. Redbone was out in the 70s, the late 60s and 70s. And the fact that they were able to go on TV in full regalia, start their show off with a stomp dance in full regalia, and go straight into Come and Get Your Love is incredible. That performance to me still floors me to this day. Like, rarely do you see that on TV. And they were proud of their indigenous heritage. They dressed in moccasins, they dressed in the regalia, and they just cared so much about their culture. And it was just so beautiful. It's just so beautiful. And I just have so much love for this documentary because it's opened my eyes to so many artists who are indigenous, who are of these ancestries, who basically, aren't talked about often enough. You know what I mean? They aren't talked about in the way that I believe that they should. I believe that they should be talked about way more in the landscape of American music. You know what I mean? And especially the ones who are Black and indigenous, because there's a lot of artists out there who were pioneers of blues, pioneers of jazz, and pioneers of rock and roll, but they were Black but had indigenous heritage as well. And I just find that to be such a amazing thing, being Black and Indigenous myself, you know what I mean? Like, I just find those two mergings of two beautiful cultures just to be so important, you know what I mean? So important. So I just wanted to come on here, talk about, you know, this movie, this documentary, and tell you that you should be out watching this movie. If you're a history buff, if you're into music, if you're into culture, go watch this movie because you'll really appreciate it a lot. Places that you can watch this movie, of course I bootleg this movie because I'm poor, but you can watch it on Amazon, you can rent it on Amazon, YouTube, iTunes, but go out and watch it because it's really important. I think it's a really important movie that everybody should go watch, just so that you know these are the artists that were out here making moves back in the day, really making an impact on the music that we have today. Because we always talk about the Black artists who are making an impact on music, and of course, you know, all music is Black music. Hello. But Indigenous people had a very big role in these creations of these music, this music as well. And I think it's important that we talk about this, you know what I mean? So yeah, everybody go and check these things out. Check them out. So some of the Indigenous artists that they talked about, like I said, Charlie Patton, who was an American Delta blues musician, considered by many to be the father of the Delta blues. He created an enduring body of American music and inspired most Delta blues musicians. Mildred Bailey, who was a jazz artist and was popular and influential, a Native American jazz singer during the 1930s, known as the Queen of Swing, the Rockin' Chair Lady, and Miss Swing. Some of her best-known hits are It's So Peaceful in the Country, Trust Me, Where Are You Going? And then you have Link Ray, and Fred Lincoln Link Ray Jr. was an American rock and roll guitarist, songwriter, and vocalist who became popular in the late 1950s. You had Jesse Davis. Jesse Edwin Davis was a Native American guitarist. He was well regarded as a session artist. His death in 1988 was attributed to a drug overdose. You have Stevie Sales. Stevie Sales is a Native American guitarist, author, television host, musician, music director, record producer, film composer, and advisor of the contemporary music at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indians. Buffy Sainte-Marie. Buffy Sainte-Marie, OC, is a Canadian singer-songwriter, musician, composer, visual artist, educator, pacifist, and social activist. Throughout her career in all of these areas, her work was focused on issues of Indigenous peoples of the America. Robbie Robertson is a Canadian musician, songwriter, film composer, producer, actor, and author. His career spans 6 decades. Roberto Francisco Castillo was an American musician. He was an Ozzy Osbourne drummer during the mid-1980s to the early 1990s, and later as a drummer for Motley Crue from 1999 to his death. Jimi Hendrix was an American rock guitarist, singer, and songwriter. Although his mainstream career spanned only 4 years, he's widely regarded as one of the most influential electric guitarists in the history of popular music and one of the most celebrated musicians of the 20th century. And then you have Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas. Known professionally as Taboo, is an American rapper, singer, songwriter, actor, and DJ, best known as the member of the hip-hop group the Black Eyed Peas, among many others. And then, of course, you had people who, contributed to the film and talked about how this music influenced others. So, yeah. Go out and check out this music. Go out and check out this film. And just go out and learn history that isn't always talked about, I'm one of those people who, growing up, I always had to find alternatives to the lie and find the truth because of the way that we are taught in this country and the way that we are taught in our schools. We are never taught about anything interesting, because why would we be? And B, we're always taught the lie before we're ever taught the truth. And so because of that, we have to go and find the truth on our own. And so that's why I appreciate documentaries like Rumble, the Indians Who Rock the World, because it's telling you things that you're never going to find out either way. You're just not. And so, yeah, please go check this documentary out. I think you're going to really like it. I think you're going to really appreciate it. And also, I just want to talk about how Delta blues and Indigenous music really came together. There's a group called, and I'm going to butcher this name, so excuse me, even though there's one of my favorite Indigenous groups of all time. Ulili. I'm pronouncing this so wrong, but it's the group that Pure Faye is in. And Pure Faye comes from North Carolina. And she is a mixture of Indigenous, Black, Taino, the whole thing. And she, in the documentary, she talks about how being Indigenous and coming from the South, from the swamps, the deep South, a lot of people just assume that the music they make was coming from Black people from Africa, and a lot of it was actually really Indigenous music that came from the swamps. It came from the Delta blues, that came from the country. And a lot of people don't know that a lot of that music was there a long time before Africans ever came here as slaves. And so it's just when the Black people came, it just became even more of a merging of the music they were making already and the Black people's music that they would make during slavery time. And the mixing of both of those was just so beautiful. You know what I mean? And, you can hear it in the banjos that the Black people, the Africans, the slaves would be playing, but then Native Americans would also play those things as well because they helped enhance the music they were making. And it was just so beautiful to see. So definitely check out this documentary. I think you're gonna really like it. And yeah, just keep this music alive, keep this energy alive, keep this history alive, and go learn history about things that aren't always told in mainstream culture, because you're not really going to hear about how Indigenous people influenced rock and roll or jazz or blues or folk or pop or anything. You know what I mean? You're not going to hear about this because it's not something that is mainstream popular, but I feel like you need to go and find out things on your own. So check out this documentary, and I'm going to leave you with that. And until next time, peace and blessings. Matakuyo Yasin.